March 23, 1944. Reich Ministry of Armaments and War Production, Berlin. On Albert Speer's polished mahogany desk sat a folder marked Geheim, nur für den Minister. Secret, for the minister's eyes only. He had not yet opened it, unaware that the information inside would break apart the last illusions still held by Germany's leaders. The folder contained carefully prepared reports from what little remained of German intelligence after the collapse of the Abwehr. Inside were figures that changed everything. The numbers were so staggering that at first Speer believed there must have been a decimal error. But the numbers were real. From his office window, Speer could see the bomb-damaged streets of Berlin, where exhausted workers cleared rubble left by another Allied raid. Despite the destruction, he had recently celebrated major increases in German arms production. By 1944, Germany was set to produce 39,807 aircraft, a figure he had proudly presented to Hitler just weeks earlier. But compared to the United States, this achievement meant almost nothing. The folder revealed that in 1944, American factories, alone without counting British or Soviet production, were on track to manufacture 96,000 aircraft, nearly 2.5 times more than Germany's best effort. And there was more than statistics. Reports included intercepted Allied communications, intelligence gathered from neutral countries, and aerial photographs. Together, they showed a reality that shattered Nazi assumptions. America wasn't straining to reach these numbers. The U.S. was producing 96,000 aircraft while also building enormous quantities of ships, tanks, trucks, and ammunition. Their industry was not just keeping pace with the war, it was outproducing every other nation on Earth. The true outcome of the conflict was being decided not only in battles, but in factory reports that made it clear. Germany had challenged an industrial power it had never fully understood. Albert Speer had been seen as a miracle worker in German war production. He took over the Armaments Ministry on February 8, 1942, after Fritz Todt was killed in a mysterious plane crash. Under his leadership, German production rose dramatically, a 300% increase despite relentless Allied bombing. Hitler hailed him as a genius of organization. Joseph Goebbels called him the man who made the impossible possible. At just 39 years old, Speer was the youngest minister in the Reich. An architect turned industrial organizer, praised as the technocrat who could bend economics to his will. His reforms had transformed German production. He reduced dozens of aircraft types from 42 down to just 5 main models. He introduced specialized single-shift production, standardized parts, and streamlined assembly lines. He took authority away from competing Nazi power groups, cut through bureaucracy, and even borrowed lessons from American auto manufacturing techniques he had studied during the 1920s. By late 1943, he had reason to feel confident. Ammunition output had increased 5-fold. Tank production had quadrupled. Aircraft output had tripled. Even with Allied bombers leveling German cities, his system of dispersing factories across the Reich kept weapons flowing to the Wehrmacht. To many, Speer proved that good organization could overcome shortages. But in early 1944, troubling reports began arriving. The data was unlike anything German leaders had ever imagined. Nazi propaganda had always portrayed the United States as a weak nation, a land of jazz musicians and movie stars, supposedly crippled by democracy and racial mixing. According to this worldview, America could never maintain large-scale production, yet intelligence showed otherwise. The awakening began in January 1944, when Luftwaffe intelligence intercepted American production reports meant for the Soviets as part of Lend-Lease shipments. General Adolf Galland, the Inspector General of Fighter Forces, discussed these findings with Speer at several meetings that year. The reports claimed that in December 1943 alone, the Americans had produced 9,113 aircraft. That single month nearly equaled Germany's total output for an entire quarter. At first, Speer dismissed the numbers as Allied propaganda designed to break morale. But then other evidence surfaced. Photographs arrived from neutral contacts, including Swedish businessmen who had traveled to the United States. They showed endless rows of B-24 Liberators lined up at the massive Willow Run plant in Michigan, One Swedish engineer who had visited the factory before America entered the war provided even more detail. According to his report, Willow Run measured 2/3 of a mile long and 1/4 of a mile wide. By April 1944, it was rolling out, a completed 4-engine bomber every 63 minutes. 2 9-hour shifts ran 6 days a week. Basic math confirmed the output. Nearly 650 bombers a month from this one facility alone. For Albert Speer, the evidence was undeniable. Germany's best organizational efforts had achieved miracles by its own standards. But against American industry, those miracles were nowhere near enough. Albert Speer leaned over the photographs, examining them closely with a magnifying glass. The images revealed not only rows of completed aircraft, but also the production process itself. Instead of workers walking around stationary planes, the aircraft moved along an assembly line from one fixed station to the next. It was Henry Ford's automotive method, now applied on an enormous scale to aviation. With the Abwehr absorbed into the SS in February 1944, Speer had to rely more heavily on alternative intelligence sources. His ministry's departments, along with what little remained of military intelligence, were tasked with analyzing American production. Information came from many channels. Swiss businessmen who still had commercial ties to American companies sent statistics from annual reports. Spanish diplomats in Washington forwarded American newspapers that openly printed production figures. Portuguese merchants shared what they saw in Atlantic ports, where U.S. shipping moved constantly. The most useful reports came from Japanese naval attachés in Berlin, who received intelligence from embassies in Argentina and Chile. These reports confirmed that American aircraft were arriving in South America in staggering numbers. At Brazilian training bases alone, 500 aircraft were being delivered each month purely for pilot training. Swedish sources provided even more precise details. The ball-bearing giant SKF, which had plants in America, gave Swedish executives access to U.S. factories. To maintain Sweden's fragile neutrality, these executives shared information with both sides. One report described the Pratt & Whitney engine plant in East Hartford, Connecticut. The facility was producing 1,000 engines per week. Its testing facilities ran around the clock. It employed 40,000 workers, including 11,000 women. Outside, the parking lots were filled with roughly 15,000 cars, the personal vehicles of its workforce. In March 1944, Speer laid all these reports across his conference table. Standing beside him was his deputy for fighter production, Karl Otto Sauer, calculator in hand, double-checking the figures. "Let us assume these numbers are exaggerated, by 50% for propaganda purposes," Speer remarked. Sauer shook his head. "Even then," he replied, "they would still be producing 48,000 aircraft annually, already more than our total production. But everything indicates there is no exaggeration at all." The evidence was overwhelming. American newspapers, easily obtained through neutral embassies, published production data without hesitation. The New York Times openly reported on Boeing's B-29 program. Time magazine ran stories on Willow Run with exact figures. Life magazine published photographs of assembly lines where serial numbers on the aircraft could be read and tracked by German intelligence. For Germany, this was unthinkable. In the Reich, production numbers were treated as state secrets. Workers signed strict oaths of secrecy. Factory locations were hidden. In contrast, the United States printed its statistics for the public to buy at newsstands. The file on Willow Run became the centerpiece of German efforts to understand American capacity. Built by the Ford Motor Company in 1941, the plant represented everything Germany's system was not. The main building alone covered 3.5 million square feet, making it larger than the entire Messerschmitt complex at Augsburg. A Swedish engineer, Per Jakobsson, who toured Willow Run in late 1943, provided a highly detailed report. According to him, the facility employed 42,000 workers, with women making up 35% of the workforce. Instead of employees moving around aircraft, the bombers rolled past them on automated conveyors. New workers required only about 3 weeks of training before joining the line. By April 1944, Willow Run's pace had reached 453 aircraft in just 468 hours. Essentially, one B-24 bomber completed every 63 minutes. Albert Speer compared these findings directly with German aircraft production. The Messerschmitt Bf-109, Germany's main fighter, required about 4,000 man-hours to build. Skilled craftsmen assembled large sections by hand, and each worker needed an average of 6 months of training before becoming productive. At Willow Run, the contrast was staggering. Each B-24 bomber required only about 1,225 man-hours in its final assembly stage. Despite being a 4-engine bomber weighing nearly 5 times as much as a Bf-109, it still required less than 1/3 of the labor to complete. Throughout 1944, Speer regularly attended conferences with Hitler at various headquarters. Each time he presented intelligence on American production, Hitler's response was always the same: outright denial and accusations of defeatism. In May, Speer brought photographs of Willow Run along with production data gathered from neutral sources. Hitler glanced at the materials briefly before dismissing them. "Propaganda," he said. "The Americans want us to believe these fantasies. No country can produce aircraft like automobiles," Speer pushed back. "But that is exactly what they are doing. They have applied automotive mass production methods to aircraft manufacturing." Hitler cut him off sharply. "These reports are Jewish lies spread by Roosevelt," he declared, ending the discussion. While Hitler refused to accept reality, other members of the leadership were less certain. Field Marshal Erhard Milch, State Secretary in the Aviation Ministry, quietly pulled Speer aside. "The numbers are correct, aren't they?" he asked. "I believe they are conservative," Speer replied. "Then we have already lost," Milch admitted. Back in Berlin, Speer ordered a detailed analysis comparing German and American aircraft production. The results were undeniable. According to the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, German aircraft production reached its peak in July 1944, with 4,219 aircraft built that month. Fighter output peaked in September at 3,375. The total for the year was 39,807 aircraft of all types. This included 25,285 fighters, 5,468 bombers, and 9,054 other types. By comparison, American production figures for 1944 were overwhelming. The monthly average was 8,000 aircraft, leading to an annual total of 96,000. This included around 16,000 4-engine heavy bombers, 35,000 fighters, and about 45,000 trainers, transports, and other aircraft types. But raw numbers told only part of the story. Each American B-24 Liberator carried the same striking power as 2 German medium bombers, yet it required proportionally less fuel, smaller crews, and reduced maintenance for every ton of bombs delivered. The qualitative advantage made the numerical disparity even greater. By spring 1944, intelligence uncovered another layer of American superiority. Reports from Argentine sources revealed that the United States was producing 420,000 tons of aluminum each year. Germany, even after gaining control of Norway's hydroelectric resources, managed only 245,000 tons. The oil situation was even more sobering. American refineries produced 7 million barrels of petroleum daily. Germany, dependent on synthetic fuel refined from coal, produced the equivalent of just 124,000 barrels per day. The United States consumed more fuel in training flights than the entire Luftwaffe used in actual combat operations. Japanese military attachés in Berlin shared a striking observation. "Your submarines sink American tankers carrying 100,000 barrels of oil, yet consumption does not decline. They simply order another tanker." For Germany's allies, this was not war in the traditional sense. It was industrial arithmetic. Beyond sheer production numbers, intelligence revealed American technological advances that Germany could not match. At Wright Field in Ohio, American engineers tested aircraft engines inside altitude chambers that simulated conditions at 50,000 feet. Germany's best facility could only reach 30,000 feet. U.S. factories applied statistical quality control, using random sampling and mathematical analysis, instead of inspecting each item by hand. This system dramatically accelerated output while maintaining reliability. The Norden bomb site, recovered from crashed B-17s, demonstrated levels of precision engineering that exceeded what German industry could achieve in mass production. Dr. Ernst Heinkel, one of Germany's leading aircraft designers, privately admitted to colleagues, "We are craftsmen building airplanes. They are industrialists manufacturing them. We cannot compete with mathematics." Intelligence on American shipbuilding provided even more proof of overwhelming industrial superiority. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States built 2,110 Liberty ships. The famous SS Robert E. Peary had been launched in just 4 days and 15 hours as a demonstration. But even under normal conditions, average construction time was only 42 days from keel to launch. By 1943 and 1944, American shipyards were producing vessels at a pace approaching 3 ships every 2 days during peak periods. German U-boats patrolling the Atlantic reported convoy after convoy filled with these cargo vessels. The strategic meaning was clear. The Americans could replace shipping losses faster than Germany could destroy them. In May 1944, intelligence reports on the Boeing B-29 Superfortress caused particular alarm. Swedish businessmen who had toured Boeing plants described the bomber's specifications, which seemed almost unbelievable. A wingspan of 141 feet 3 inches, a maximum loaded weight of 140,000 pounds, a bomb load of 20,000 pounds, a combat range of 3,700 miles, a pressurized cabin for high-altitude flight, remote-controlled gun turrets. Production had begun in 1943, with 3,970 B-29s eventually completed across 4 factories. Meanwhile, Germany's most advanced bomber concept, the Heinkel He-277, remained nothing more than a design on paper. The Americans, in contrast, already had the B-29 in mass production, with hundreds delivered to training units by mid-1944. When shown photographic evidence, Hermann Göring dismissed the reports, saying, "Nobody can build such aircraft in quantity." But Adolf Galland and other more realistic officers knew otherwise. Galland later wrote in his memoirs, "This was not bluff. It was industrial reality." Further confirmation came from captured American pilots. Their interrogations revealed another critical disparity: training. U.S. pilots received between 250 and 400 hours of flight instruction before being assigned to combat. Primary training lasted 60 hours. Basic training added another 70 hours. Advanced training ranged between 50 and 75 hours. Finally, transition training required 75 to 170 hours. By comparison, German fighter pilots in 1944 entered combat with an average of only 112 hours, already reduced from 160 hours earlier in the year. By 1945, the average had fallen to just 50 hours. Severe fuel shortages meant that many young German pilots never even flew their assigned aircraft until their very first combat mission. Captured airmen often confirmed these realities. Technical. Sergeant William Barnes, a B-17 crew chief taken prisoner after his bomber was shot down, revealed during interrogation, "We were losing about 60 bombers a month over Germany, but Boeing alone was producing 140 bombers every month. We had more bombers than trained crews." The D-Day invasion in June 1944 demonstrated American material power on a scale never seen before. More than 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and 150,000 men were committed in the first wave alone. Yet Hitler insisted that this was America's maximum effort and could not be sustained. Albert Speer knew otherwise. Intelligence from Argentina confirmed that U.S. shipyards were regularly launching new Essex-class aircraft carriers. Each carrier required 27,000 tons of steel and carried 90 to 100 aircraft. In contrast, Germany's only carrier project, the Graf Zeppelin, remained unfinished after 6 years of construction. Economic intelligence painted an equally stark picture. Dr. Karl Krauk, chairman of IG Farben's supervisory board, reported through Swiss intermediaries that the Americans were producing 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber each year, compared to Germany's 120,000 tons. He admitted, They have solved the butadiene production problem that limits us. They share technology while we guard secrets. They multiply efficiency through cooperation. In July 1944, reconnaissance photographs of Detroit's industrial region revealed a level of concentration greater than the entire Ruhr Valley. Willow Run alone covered 1,600 acres. The Ford River Rouge complex spanned 2,000 acres. The Chrysler Tank Arsenal occupied 100 acres. General Motors facilities combined exceeded 5,000 acres. Analysts identified hundreds of massive factory buildings, thousands of vehicles filling parking lots, dozens of power plants, and railway yards handling more than 1,000 freight cars every single day. By August 1944, German aircraft production reached its peak. At the same time, Speer fully accepted that defeat was inevitable. A comprehensive intelligence report laid out the facts. American production between January and June 1944 totaled 48,000 aircraft, putting them on pace for 96,000 that year. They also produced approximately 14,000 tanks, more than 300,000 military trucks, hundreds of naval vessels, and 75 million tons of merchant shipping. Germany's output over the same six-month period looked far smaller. 19,800 aircraft, 9,700 tanks and assault guns, 47,000 military trucks, and 193 U-boats, with merchant shipping practically non-existent. The trends were unmistakable. American production was still accelerating, while Germany's was beginning to collapse under relentless strategic bombing. The oil campaign had reduced fuel supplies to catastrophic levels. Transportation networks were paralyzed, leaving finished weapons stranded in factories. By late 1944, German intelligence began receiving fragmentary reports of an enormous new American project, a development that hinted the industrial gap would only grow wider. While the atomic purpose of America's secret project remained hidden, the scale of industry supporting it was unmistakable. Reports described facilities consuming staggering amounts of electricity. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, for example, was using 1/17 of all U.S. electrical production. Peak demand reached 298,800 kilowatts. To German analysts, it appeared that the Americans were committing resources equal to Germany's entire V-weapon program to a single project whose purpose was unknown. By September 1944, assessments made it clear that the gulf between German and American production was not only about numbers, it was philosophical. American industry focused on simplification for mass output, interchangeability of parts between manufacturers, statistical quality, control and narrow worker specialization. German industry, by contrast, favored complex designs meant to showcase engineering skill. Unique components from each manufacturer, hand craftsmanship, and workers trained as broad generalists. As Albert Speer later reflected, "We built aircraft as works of engineering art. They produced them as industrial products. The Me-262 jet fighter was technically superior, but Germany could only produce 20 per month. The Americans, Speer believed, would have redesigned it for efficiency and rolled out 200 monthly." By November 1944, even Hermann Göring could no longer deny American superiority in production. The Battle of Leyte Gulf had proven the scale of American naval power. The U.S. Navy deployed more aircraft carriers than Germany had destroyers. At a Luftwaffe conference, General Adolf Galland presented grim statistics. American fighters outnumbered Luftwaffe fighters 15-1 over German skies. U.S. pilots arrived with 400 hours of flight training, compared to German pilots averaging just 50. American engines ran for 400 hours between overhauls, while German engines managed barely 25. Galland summed it up bluntly: "We face not one Air Force but several. The 8th Air Force alone has 3,000 heavy bombers. Each American Air Force is larger than our entire Luftwaffe." The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 delivered the final confirmation. Even though German forces achieved total surprise at the outset, the American response was overwhelming. Within days, they shifted 250,000 men, 50,000 vehicles, and 500,000 tons of supplies to block the offensive. Captured U.S. supply depots shocked German officers. A single depot held more supplies than some entire divisions of the Wehrmacht. In January 1945, Speer compiled his most detailed report yet. Swiss banking contacts forwarded American war bond advertisements that openly listed production figures. They proudly declared, "Your war bonds have built 317 aircraft from 1940 to 1945, 86,000 tanks, 6 million trucks, 6,500 naval vessels, and 2,710 Liberty ships." In Germany, such figures would have been guarded as state secrets. In America, they were printed in magazines to encourage public investment. On January 30th, the anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, Speer attended what would be his last major conference in a desperate attempt to convince Hitler to seek peace terms. "Mein Führer, we must face reality," he pleaded. "The Americans produce in 1 month what we produce in a year." Hitler's reply revealed just how far removed he was from reality. Wars are won by will, not production statistics. On March 18, 1945, Speer submitted a memorandum warning Hitler that Germany's economy would collapse completely within 4 to 8 weeks. By then, even the most loyal officials knew that the end was near. The next day, March 19th, Hitler issued his infamous Nero Decree, ordering the destruction of Germany's remaining infrastructure. Albert Speer responded on March 29th with a memorandum firmly opposing this plan. He argued, "The enemy's superiority in weapons and industrial capacity has reached proportions that render further resistance meaningless. The Americans can replace in weeks what we destroy. We cannot rebuild in decades." Hitler accused Speer of treason and defeatism, but by this point Speer no longer cared. The production statistics had convinced him since mid-1944 that Germany's defeat was inevitable. By April 1945, as American forces advanced toward Berlin, intelligence reports still arrived highlighting U.S. production strength. A captured issue of Fortune magazine revealed the scale of America's automotive industry. In 1941, U.S. factories had built 88 million civilian vehicles. By wartime conversion, the same industry was producing millions of military trucks, thousands of aircraft, and tens of thousands of tanks. As the Third Reich collapsed, the statistics told a story no propaganda could erase. Verified U.S. production from 1940 to 1945 included 317 military aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 6 million military trucks, 639,000 jeeps, 257,000 artillery pieces, 62 million machine guns, 6,500 naval vessels, 2,710 Liberty ships. German totals by comparison from 1939 to 1945 stood at 95,000 aircraft, 63,800 tanks and self-propelled guns, 345,000 military trucks, 61,000 artillery pieces, 22 million machine guns, 171 U-boats. The ratios were staggering: 2 to 1 in aircraft, 35 to 1 in tanks, despite Germany's longer production span, and 5 to 1 in trucks. These figures did not even count the additional Lend-Lease production supplied to Britain and the Soviet Union. After the war, the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey confirmed that German intelligence had actually underestimated American production. German estimates for U.S. aircraft output in 1944 predicted only 22,440 aircraft. The actual figure was 96,318, a 330% miscalculation. Speer's memoirs, Inside the Third Reich, emphasized his own achievements and relationship with Hitler. Yet in post-war interrogations and later interviews, he admitted the overwhelming scale of American industry. In a 1970s interview, he reflected, "By early 1944, I knew with certainty that Germany would lose the war. American production of $96,000 aircraft in 1944 was not a surge. It was sustainable indefinitely." Other German leaders supported this view. Field Marshal Erhard Milch testified, "When I learned America produced 9,000 aircraft in a single month, I knew the war was lost." Admiral Karl Donitz admitted, "When intelligence reported Americans building escort carriers faster than we could build submarines, I knew the Battle of the Atlantic was lost." General Adolf Galland later wrote, "Each American pilot we shot down was replaced by 2 more better trained. We faced not an enemy, but an avalanche." U.S. technology only widened the gap. The proximity fuse increased the effectiveness of anti-aircraft fire by 700%, with 22 million units produced. Germany never developed an equivalent. American radar advanced along multiple production lines, mass-producing thousands of sets, while German radar was built by hand in far smaller numbers. The turbocharger gave U.S. fighters decisive high-altitude performance. General Electric built 300,000 during the war, while German attempts to copy captured versions failed due to metallurgical limits in mass production. The economic disparity was absolute. In 1944, America's gross national product stood at $210 billion. Germany's was only $45 billion. Victory in the end was determined not by will alone, but by sheer industrial power. America devoted 45% of its economy to war production, while Germany pushed its share to 65%. Yet despite that higher percentage, American war output was still greater than Germany's entire gross national product. Historians would later point out that the United States could afford to lose in one single battle the equivalent of Germany's entire annual production, and still continue fighting without pause. The Americans could sustain levels of waste that would have collapsed the German economy. Pilot training highlighted the same imbalance. Over the course of the war, the United States trained 435,000 pilots, compared to only 57,000 trained by Germany. By 1945, many American pilots were fighting against German flyers who had never even fired their weapons during training. Luftwaffe General Johannes Steinhoff would later admit, "We sent children to fight professionals. It was not combat, it was execution." The realization of American industrial superiority created a psychological crisis among Germany's leaders. Their mindset passed through predictable stages: denial, rationalization, desperation, delusion, and at last, reluctant acceptance. These mental shifts shaped military strategy, driving increasingly reckless decisions that only sped up the Reich's collapse. Perhaps the greatest irony was that American industry succeeded precisely where Nazi ideology claimed it could not. Racial integration and gender equality in the workplace proved far more efficient than Germany's doctrine of Aryan supremacy. U.S. factories, staffed by a diverse workforce, achieved more voluntarily than Germany's forced labor system could ever produce. In his later years, Albert Speer reflected on these lessons. "We confused military prowess with industrial strength. We believed racial ideology could overcome numerical reality. We thought willpower could defeat production. Every assumption proved false." When I learned that America built 96,000 aircraft in 1944, I knew not just that we would lose, but that we had already lost. The fighting dragged on for another year, but the war's outcome had been sealed. World War II was not decided only on the beaches of Normandy or in the ruins of Berlin. It was decided in Detroit's factories, in California's shipyards, and in Seattle's aircraft plants. It was decided by workers who never carried rifles but whose labor guaranteed victory. Germany had challenged the world's greatest industrial power with little more than ideology and courage. In the end, the truth was clear. In modern warfare, production is strategy, logistics is tactics, and industrial capacity is victory. The Americans understood this from the start. Germany learned it far too late. Speer's acknowledgement of U.S. industrial superiority marked the turning point when rational German leaders understood the war was unwinnable. The 96,000 aircraft built in 1944 were not just machines. They were the embodiment of a system of mass production working at full strength. Each B-24 rolling off Willow Run's line every 63 minutes symbolized the triumph of democratic industrial organization over totalitarian control. The so-called production war proved that in modern conflict, the factory floor could be as decisive as any battlefield. When Albert Speer realized that America had produced 96,000 aircraft in a single year, he also realized the future was already decided. Germany's defeat was inevitable, The conversion of American industry from consumer goods to weapons represented the largest concentration of industrial power in history. Against this, the Third Reich never had a chance. The story of Speer's recognition is, in the end, a lesson in the decisive power of industrial democracy. In 1944, that power was undeniably, overwhelmingly, and unmatchably American. Those 96,000 aircraft were not just war machines, they were proof that totalitarian ambition would always collapse before democratic industrial might.